ladies and gentlemen. Hi, welcome to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library. I'm Chris Nordyke, the Director of Marketing for the Richard Nixon Foundation, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. You're here to hear about America's military involvement in the world throughout history, and you're going to hear about that shortly from someone who has a passion in studying exactly that. Now, you may notice when you sat down that there's a postcard. That is some of our upcoming events. I encourage you all to come back, especially next week on Monday, President's Day. We're going to celebrate with free admission, free cherry pie. We've got a Mount Rushmore of presidential impersonators coming. That includes George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, President Lincoln, and President Teddy Roosevelt. They're going to do a program at 1 o'clock. It's titled Meet the Presidents. It's great for adults and for youngsters alike. We get them involved. Do it every year, and it's a real hit. So I encourage you to come. And then Monday evening, we will have presidential historian Ed Larson for a lecture on his book, The Return of George Washington, at 6 p.m. So please come back Monday. Now, I do want to introduce who some of you may have already met, a special guest in the room tonight. He is not only a World War II vet, but also the star of the television series, The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp. Let's give Hugh O'Brien a round of applause. Hugh has a book out titled Hugh O'Brien or What's Left of Him, and we coincidentally have that for sale in our museum store, and Hugh has agreed to autograph after the program, so I encourage you to pick that up. Our speaker tonight, he's had a lifelong interest in studying military history, comes from a military family, and is a California native, and is author of American Invades. His book here is also available in our museum store, and he will autograph it after the program. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Christopher Kelly. Christopher.
Thanks, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much, and good evening. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. Appreciate your interest. My name is Chris Kelly, and I am the co-author with Stuart Laycock of a book called America Invades. Our subtitle is How We've Invaded or Been Militarily Involved with Almost Every Country on Earth. The story of our book is pretty simple. My co-author is an Englishman. His name is Stuart Laycock, and he wrote this book, which is called All the Countries We've Invaded, which was written from a British perspective. And the conclusion of this book is that 90% of all the countries in the world have at some point been invaded by Britain. I read this book. It came out in 2012. I read this book. I enjoyed it. I wrote a review of it, and I forwarded it to the author, who I'd never met before. He reached out to me and said, where do you live? I live part-time in London, part-time in Seattle. And he said, great, why don't we meet for a pint? We met in London for a pint. I said, well, your book is interesting about Britain and her invasions, but what about America? We don't have quite as much history, but we have been kind of catching up in the invasions category, so to speak. And so our book, American Invades, is an answer to the same question he was asking in his book, where he went through every country in the world, from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, and talked about what America has done in those countries. And what we learned is that we have invaded, when the book came out, it was 84. We actually revised it for the ebook to 85. That 85 out of the 194 countries in the world that are listed in the UN, we have at some point invaded. And we've been militarily involved with, out of 191, so all but 3. And the only 3 we've missed entirely are Andorra, Bhutan, and Liechtenstein. Now, military involvement is different from invasion. Like, so, for instance, take Portugal, for example. We haven't invaded Portugal, but we've had bases on the Azores since World War II, and they're still there to this day. So we considered Portugal a case of military involvement. So, just to give an example. So in our story, surprisingly, starts in 1741. And people look at that and they say, how on earth can that be? There was no United States in 1741. And you're right, there wasn't. But it wasn't a United States government invasion, but it was an American invasion, because there were, of course, Americans living in the colonies at that time. And in 1741, there was a war going on, and it was called the War of Jenkins' Ear. And it was fought between the British and the Spanish. And there was a commander, and his name was from the Royal Navy, and he was Admiral Edmund Vernon. And he led an expedition that attacked what is today Colombia. In 1740, Edward Vernon attacked Colombia. And in that expedition, there were about 3,500 American colonial troops, one of whom happened to be a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Washington, who was the older half-brother of George, our first president. And the expedition was not successful. They didn't really capture Cartagena, but Lawrence was sufficiently enamored of his commanding officer, and he spoke highly of his officer to his younger brother. And as a consequence, George ended up naming his home Mount Vernon in honor of an admiral of the Royal Navy. So there's a connection between our original our first president and the first American invasion in 1741. Our invasions began early. In 1776, this is a letter which is reproduced in the book as well. But if you notice, it says at the bottom, it's signed B. Arnold. That's as in Benedict Arnold, the one who was the famous traitor. But this is before he was a traitor. This is when he was on the Patriot side. He wrote this letter. And it happens to be a letter that concerns an ancestor of mine whose name was Captain Van Rensselaer. And Captain Van Rensselaer is participating, you see at the bottom, at the Siege of Quebec in March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, actually, 1776. So this is, again, even before the 4th of July isn't until July 4th. So even before then, we were clearly invading Quebec and besieging Quebec during the American Revolution. In 1778, also during the American Revolution, John Paul Jones led a raid on Whitehaven. John Paul Jones is known as the father of the American Navy. Even though he actually was Scottish and the son of a Scottish gardener, he's the father of the American Navy and buried with pomp and circumstance at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. But in 1778, he led the raid on Whitehaven. Let me see. Okay, here's a picture that I took. Whitehaven is a town in Cumbria, in England, on the west coast of northern England. And this is John Paul Jones, and what he's doing is he's spiking a gun, which means he's driving a nail into the touchstone of a cannon, which will render it inoperable. What he did in April of 1778 is he was on board the captain of the USS Ranger, a famous ship that, of course, got used many other times in American naval history too. But he led this raid with about 30 of his crewmen, and they split into two small boats. And one went with the Marine lieutenant, and one went with John Paul Jones. The one with the Marine lieutenant found a pub that happened to, and they broke it open, and they had a good time. The one with John Paul Jones ended up burning a coal ship that was in the harbor. And I mean, if you ask most English people today, who was the last country to invade England, very few of them will be able to tell you that it was actually Americans that invaded England last in 1778. Whitehaven today, it's a sleepy little fishing village. It was a big coal village at the time, and right up until the 80s. But in 1999, okay, you fast forward many years later to recent times, the town of Whitehaven got the idea of officially pardoning John Paul Jones for his raid and giving the U.S. Navy the rights of the harbor to come back, and they actually have come back and visited Whitehaven since then. And this has turned into a major festival for Whitehaven and a source of income for their community because they do food and music and entertainment in the summer, but it's all built around this history of the bloody Americans raiding in Whitehaven in 1778. Americans have fought in many wars, many times. And sometimes we fought without our government. And this is an example. If you go to Portsmouth in the UK, you'll find the Battleship Victory, which was Nelson's flagship at the Battle of Trafalgar. And the thing that I think is surprising is that there are more Americans than any other nationality that's not from the UK. In other words, okay, there are more English than Scottish and Irish and Welsh. But the next nationality in terms of those who served on board the Victory are actually Americans. There are 22 of them. Now, some of them had been impressed. They weren't necessarily there because they loved England. They might have been, dragooned in a pub or something and got stuck in it. But they did fight, and they also had a right to earn prizes. So Americans have been fighting in other wars. In this case, fighting against Trafalgar was against the French and the Spanish on the English side. But Americans have been fighting in many wars, for a long time, sometimes without our government, and we'll have some other examples of that too. The Constitution. If you go to Boston Harbor, you'll find the Old Ironsides, one of a great ship that's still afloat. Unlike the Victory, it actually goes out and they do a lottery to take people out on board the Ironsides. It's a great thing to visit. But it went all over the world and it got involved. This is also Old Ironsides. This is the Constitution fighting against the HMS Java off the coast of Brazil during the War of 1812, December of 1812, 44-gun frigate. But so yes, we were fighting in Brazil in 1812. 1824, now this is William Walker. Some may have heard of him. He was referred to as the Gray-Eyed Man of Destiny. He was from Nashville, Tennessee, and born in 1824, died 1860 at the age of 37. But in the space of 37 years, he managed to invade Mexico, Nicaragua twice, and then finally Honduras when he was caught up with and executed on the beach in Honduras. He actually was elected president of the Republic of Nicaragua. This again was not the U.S. government, but they were Americans that were involved in these invasions in Central America. This is Matthew Perry, this is from Newport, Rhode Island, and Perry was the one who brought the black ships to Japan. He was sent by President Millard Fillmore to open up Japan, which was really a closed society at that time and didn't trade with others. Japanese were not allowed to go, and foreigners were not allowed to come in. And it was Matthew Perry that really changed that in the U.S. Navy. This is a statue of Ensign John Monaghan. This is in front of the Spokane Club in Spokane, Washington. He was in the first graduating class of Gonzaga University and also a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy as well. And he was killed fighting in Samoa in 1899 in a kind of a brush fire war which pitted the English, who actually were allied with the Americans, against the Germans, who were both kind of competing for influence out in the Pacific at the time. This is a plane, this is a replica of Eddie Rickenbacker's SPAD 13. It's actually a French-built plane, but Rickenbacker was the #1 World War I ace for the American forces in the First World War. And of course, here we are just last year celebrating the centennial of the beginning of World War I. This, again, World War I, this was taken in Central Park with the 107th Regiment, the doughboys that were fighting in World War I. There were about, in the American Expeditionary Force, there were over 2.5 million Americans that went overseas to fight in the Great War, starting in 1917 in World War I. And of course, they had to rely upon, in order to get over from the East Coast of the United States to Europe, they had to rely upon the same technology that had proven so effective with the Titanic in 1912, except that they also had the trouble of worrying about the Kaiser's submarines sinking at the same time. So we ended up getting involved in other countries, establishing bases in Ireland at the time with World War I in order to help to protect those convoys. This is Queen Marie of Romania. She comes into our story in the Romania chapter. She was kind of an Amazon queen. She was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and she led her nation onto the Allied side, really at the same time as the United States in 1917, joining against the Central Powers, against Germany and Austria, and she received American assistance at the time as well. Let's see. Oh, this is the Battleship Texas. This was launched just prior to World War I. You can find this ship in LaPorte, Texas, near Houston today. It did convoy duty in World War I, and then it also served in it's the last remaining dreadnought in the world, in the planet. If you want to see what a dreadnought battleship looks like, this is the only one that's still afloat. And it was used also to provide shore bombardment at Normandy on June 6th, 1944, and also at Iwo Jima in 1945, just coming up on 70 years ago this year. This is a war memorial from World War I about the people that helped the convoys to bring those American soldiers and ferry them across. What I thought was interesting about this is in Brest, France, is that it's an American naval memorial in France. Well, when during World War II came along and France fell and was occupied by the Germans, they came along and they found this monument to American valor, and they didn't like it very much. So they actually took like a sledgehammer and they destroyed the monument. This had been built in the 1920s after World War I. So this was destroyed during the German occupation. It turned into a naval bunker. And then it was rebuilt exactly as it had been before in the 1950s. So that's what you see today. And that was before Pearl Harbor, of course. That was we're talking about the summer of 1940, prior to Pearl Harbor. This is a monument that you can find in Troy, Michigan. And these are what they call Detroit's own polar bears. This is the polar bear expedition. These were Americans that served in Russia in 1918 and 19. That were sent by President Wilson, and it was basically an intervention in the Russian Revolution on the white side. There were also troops sent to Vladivostok who fought alongside the Japanese as well. But we did get involved in Russia, and the Russians tend to remember this better than we do today. This is a monument from Grosvenor Square, which is where the American Embassy is in London, and this is the American Eagles. These were, again, Americans that fought in spite of their country, in a sense, because they volunteered to fight for the RAF during the Battle of Britain when America was neutral. And they stood to risk not only their lives, but also their passports and, to be fine. I mean, they were defying their government in order to fight on the British side in World War II prior to our involvement. Also in the same square, Grosvenor Square, statue of FDR, who of course led us in World War II, for most of World War II. This is the Pampanito, something from California. You can find this in San Francisco in Fisherman's Wharf, the USS Pampanito. The American submarines sank about 60% of all the Japanese shipping during World War II, and they're very much were doing a blockade of that island at the close of the war. Jimmy Doolittle led the famous raid on Tokyo. 30 Seconds Over Tokyo was the movie, and but it was in April of 1942 that FDR ordered Doolittle to attack Tokyo, less than 6 months after Pearl Harbor. B-25 Mitchell, this is the type of plane that was used for Doolittle's raid. This happens to be from the RAF Museum in London. A Jeep from World War II, over 600,000 of these were made in the war. Many were used in Lend-Lease, other allies used them too. The Soviets had lots of these as well. This is from Normandy. If you go to an air museum and you happen to see a plane that has black and white stripes like that, you can immediately impress your friends by telling them that that it flew at D-Day, because those are what is called the D-Day stripes. They painted the black and white stripes on the planes to identify them as Allied planes, whether they were fighters or transports or bombers or whatever. They did that because back in 1943, when we were invading Sicily in Italy, we hadn't done this, and there was a tremendous amount of friendly fire, and hundreds of Americans were killed by kind of trigger-happy young men with machine guns seeing planes overhead many were killed with friendly fire. And this was to avoid this, and it really did help. Now, right next to it, you see, this is a C-47 transport plane. People were jumping out of this on the 5th of June, and one of them, Private John Steele, landed on this church in Saint-Mary-Église in Normandy, and they were trying to secure the flanks of the front for the amphibious invasion. And you can see the paratrooper, with the mannequin there to this day. You go inside of the church, this very same church in France, in Normandy, and you see the Virgin Mary surrounded by American paratroopers, which is, not a sight that you see every day. Patton. This is Patton, of course, classic American invader, invading Morocco, invading Tunisia, fighting in through France, in Belgium, Luxembourg during the Battle of the Bulge. Sherman, most common tank of American tank of World War II, and Allied tank. These are the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. These are the cliffs that the Rangers went up. You can just barely tell on the edge of that picture the Ranger Memorial. They went up here in the face of Germans on top, firing down at them, throwing grenades down at them. An amazing place to see if you have a chance. P-51 Mustang, this is kind of the iconic World War I fighter World War II fighter of the war. And you also happen to have Donald Duck on the thing that Disney doesn't usually give much of their art out. They did during the war. So, Tommy Hitchcock was an American pilot. He was actually a pilot in the Lafayette Escadrille. He volunteered and served his country in World War I. He was shot down over the enemy lines and was captured. Went a German prisoner of war in World War I. He somehow managed to escape, made his way to Switzerland, and then after the war, he became one of the most famous American polo players of all time. But he also was a pilot. And when World War II came along, he also became actually a banker for Lehman Brothers and was working in London. And when the World War II came along, he wanted to serve his country. He ended up, he had the idea of taking the P-51, which was designed actually here with North American Aviation in Southern California, and marrying it together with Rolls-Royce engines, which is what improved it and enabled it to escort bombers all the way to Berlin. Unfortunately, he was killed test flying one of these experimental P-51s just before D-Day, and he's buried at the Cambridge American Cemetery in the UK. This is Anthony McAuliffe. He's the one who said nuts when he was surrounded at the Battle of the Bulge just 70 years ago this past December, with his famous defiance. That's from the square in Bastogne in Belgium. This is the spirit of American youth rising from the waves at Normandy. This is Douglas MacArthur, who famously led invasions of the Philippines in 44, 45, to when I Shall Return came back to the Philippines, and also in Incheon in the Korean War, which really turned around the Korean War, which would have been a disaster. And you think about, everybody today takes for granted Samsung mobile devices, Kia cars, Hyundai cars, all of these consumer products that come from South Korea that really owe, in a sense, a debt of gratitude to Douglas MacArthur and what he did at Incheon and what American forces did, because otherwise South Korea would not have existed. I mean, you would have had the whole peninsula under North Korean control. This picture I took in 2011. This is on the bridge on the River Kwai. Many of you may be familiar with the movie. It's a classic war movie. And there's a tune in it called Colonel Bogey's March. I can't whistle very well, but it's like that. You know the tune. Well, this guy, I go to the bridge. I see this guy, gentleman, playing it on his violin, playing the tune. And I put $1 into his violin case. He said, "Come over here with me. Come over here. Feel the side of the bridge." So I went over and I felt the side of the bridge, and I could feel the marks from bullet holes, from strafing of Allied planes that had been trying to shoot down the bridge. This bridge, of course, was built by prisoner labor, slave labor at the time. Many people, many Americans and many others were killed in the construction of this, what they call the Railway of Death in Thailand, trying to resupply, the Japanese trying to resupply their forces. It's not just World War II with our book. We cover Vietnam. This is from Hue in Vietnam, famous battle fought there, 1968, with the Marines and with the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. You can kind of see the bullet-riddled part. This is the old imperial city of Vietnam. This is a friend of mine named Jack Coughlin. This picture was taken, I think, 1969, in front of his trainer. He later flew C-130s in the war. He was in the U.S. Air Force, and he flew. I was interviewing him for the book, and he said he flew something called jingle runs. And I said, Jack, what is a jingle run? I've never heard of this. He said, well, they would load his C-130 with 3 pallets, wooden pallets. Each pallet would contain $10 million in $20 bills. And this was a way that the U.S. government would, and he was flying from Taipei in Taiwan to Saigon. And this is a means that we had of paying the South Vietnamese government during the Vietnam War. And a technique that has been used in Afghanistan and Iraq more recently, too. SR-71 Blackbird, Cold War airplane, spy plane. This was the improved version of it. U-2 was shot down famously with Gary Powers, and this was a plane that flew at over 3 Mach and actually set the fastest piloted plane record ever and was never shot down. Let's see, you have a statue of Reagan in also at Grosvenor Square in London, involved with fighting in supporting the Contras in Nicaragua, supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet invasion of that country, and then, of course, the invasion of Grenada in 1983. The Bushes, I'm sure we're familiar with invasion of Kuwait, with H.W. Bush, invasion of Panama, Iraq, Afghanistan, and also Liberia as well. A-10 Warthog, this is a plane in Duxford for combat support. Let's see, the 9/11 Memorial, of course, is a source of many more recent American involvements in invasions in the world. And this, this is kind of somewhat whimsical, but in 2014, there was an American invasion of, some people may be familiar with, the younger members may be familiar with Minecraft, which is a game where you can do you can simulate any kind of building or object. And the Danes did Minecraft Denmark, and it turned out to be American hackers that went in and raised the stars and stripes over virtual Copenhagen. And so we invaded Minecraft Denmark. There's some invasions are kind of funny. Not all are tragic. This is my co-author and I in front of a couple friends of ours from London with Stu and I. We're working on our sequel, which is going to be, Stu did the British invasions, we did American invasions together, and we're actually working to have this fall our next book come out, which is going to be called Italy Invades. It's not Italy just in the sense of Mussolini, but also going back to the Romans, who of course invaded all over Europe and the Mediterranean, North Africa. They were in Iraq 2,000 years ago as well. But not just that, but also things like Italian Americans. Like for instance, the Solomon Islands. The Italians have not invaded the Solomon Islands, no, but Italian Americans sure have. Because about 1 in 12 of the American GIs were of Italian ancestry. So we're going to be talking about that for our next book. And then I thought that I needed to talk a little bit about, because we're here at the Nixon Library, about Nixon as Commander-in-Chief. Nixon, when you look at this whole span of American military history, and you just look at those dates of 69 to 74 when he was president, you have to kind of say that he came in at an incredibly difficult time in American military history. In 1968, the year before, you'd had the Tet Offensive, you'd had Bobby Kennedy killed, Martin Luther King killed. You'd had a tumultuous, incredibly difficult time in American history in general, and also specifically in American military history. And you had a war that had already divided the country. and that Nixon basically inherited. And you had the most casualties of all of the years of the 10 years or so of the Vietnam conflict from an American standpoint. The highest casualties were in 1968, and they were running about 300 young Americans per week were being killed at that time in the year that Nixon was elected. So he inherited an incredibly difficult and challenging situation. He inherited Vietnam, and then ultimately, of course, he ended it. Now, in the course of doing that and being able to get the agreement with the Paris Accords, he invaded Cambodia in 1970, what was called an incursion, but was, we would classify as an invasion. And also he, of course, was bombing Laos as well. The reason for that was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that the geography was, such that the Viet Cong were being resupplied through these neutral countries of Cambodia and Laos. And so in order to interdict that supply lines, the administration felt it was necessary to launch these invasions of those countries. Nixon had a profound impact on the military. Obviously, he ended the draft. The draft had been in place since World War II, selective service, and Nixon ended the draft and went to an all-volunteer military, tremendous transformation of the U.S. military. Nixon also went to China and divided what the communism was perceived to be a monolith. Everything was red on the map of the Soviet Union and China. And what Nixon realized was that China was very different from the Soviet Union and had different interests, and there were profound effects by going to China in 1972 that we feel to this day, of course. He also went to the Soviet Union in 1972, the same year, negotiated SALT ABM treaties, helped to try to diffuse the Cold War to eliminate the danger of some kind of nuclear Armageddon in exchange, and so he did that. There was also the Bangladesh crisis of 1971, which was a terrible kind of human tragedy, and there were hundreds of thousands of casualties in what was East Pakistan that became Bangladesh, and there was a tremendous conflict between Pakistan and India at that time. India was part of the neutral movement and was getting support from the Soviet Union, and Pakistan, on the other hand, was an American ally, the Nixon did send the USS Enterprise, a carrier, to India in support of Pakistan during the crisis. Indira Gandhi had an interesting reaction when the American carrier arrived. She was asked, what should we, the military, her Indian Navy asked, what should we do? She said, why don't you invite them to tea? And and apparently she did. And so, there was no, I'm not saying that we invaded India, we didn't, but certainly we've had some military involvement with India too, and Gandhi's reaction is interesting. The Yom Kippur War, 73, was a crisis, of course, during the Nixon administration, and when you had Israel being attacked by Egypt and Syria and other countries, and it was a desperate battle, and with lots of supplies going from the Soviet Union to the Arab nations against Israel, and this was during Watergate. I'm not here to talk about Watergate, but this was during the Watergate crisis, which was a huge diversion for the administration at the time, and Nixon was not making a lot of decisions at that time. But one of the decisions that he did make was to very actively resupply Israel. And there were like 550 sorties that were sent of equipment to Israel. And they were extremely grateful. I think remember Nixon fondly to this day as a result of that. There's been a lot of talk about how Nixon, with going into Cambodia, may have been influenced by Patton. By the movie, if you know 1970 Oscar award-winning movie Patton with George C. Scott, about his a great movie, I think, and Nixon enjoyed the movie. He watched it several times. I mean, to me, I think that's, it's an interesting observation, but I think it's relatively trite and superficial. I mean, I think the real question is, Nixon may have enjoyed the movie, whether it influenced policy, I don't know, who knows. But what the real question, I think, is, was Nixon influenced by World War II? And here we can say that Nixon, who served in the U.S. Navy, I think the answer is unqualified, profoundly so. I mean, that Nixon he served in Iowa in the Navy. He served in the Solomons on Guadalcanal, in the Pacific Theater in the war, which I think is particularly significant. He was a witness to the fact that the war in the Pacific started much earlier. Of course, we think of World War II starting in 1939 with the invasion of Poland, but that's not in fact true. The war started in 1937 with Japan attacking China. And China took more casualties than any other nation in World War II, with the exception of the Soviet Union. And because Nixon was in the Pacific, he was aware of China's suffering. And I'm sure that may have played a role in how he perceived China later on and made a huge difference with it. That's just one example. Another example is Munich. I mean, if you're familiar, this is Chamberlain with negotiating what they call the sellout at Munich, where he came back. He negotiated with Hitler, peace in our time, and brought back the piece of paper and said, no, we're not going to go to war because I have made a deal with Hitler, and of course Czechoslovakia got gobbled up by Hitler. And you see here you have you've got these fascist bayonets sticking up. This is Mussolini's Italy, and then the swastika, and he's walking with an umbrella. I mean, that's Chamberlain walking with an umbrella. Now, Nixon took on board what had happened at Munich and took it very much to heart, to the extent that when he was vice president with Eisenhower, he actually banned the use of umbrellas, that he did not want to be, because he was afraid of, he didn't want to have any association whatsoever with Chamberlain and the betrayal at Munich. And when I say this influenced Nixon, it didn't just influence Nixon. It influenced JFK, it influenced LBJ, it influenced all Western politicians at the time, that nobody wanted to have this repeat of this sellout at Munich. And that influenced the way that they responded to events. And then, of course, you have to point out, again, World War II influence on Nixon. I mean, who was his greatest political patron? Without question, it was this man, Dwight Eisenhower, who selected him to become a vice presidential candidate and served with him as a candidate. And of course, Ike, this is a statue of Ike in Grosvenor Square as well. Ike was, he can be called, I think accurately, the greatest American invader of all time. I mean, that he fought and planned the D-Day invasion, and he showed that decisive victory can bring peace, which it did in Europe, and it was obviously a huge mentor to Nixon. And then also, again, finally, with the World War II in the Pacific, I mean, how did the war in the Pacific end? 7 years ago this year, in August of this year. Obviously, it ended with the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what was the lesson that politicians, that people learned from that? They learned that bombing can bring decisive victory, and that bombing can actually save lives. I mean, that as a result of the bombing, they did not have to make a land amphibious invasion of Japan, which would have been tremendously costly in lives, not only of American and Allied lives, but also of Japanese as well. And so that was kind of the lesson, one of the lessons that Nixon learned from the end of World War II in the Pacific. Decisive victory can bring a lasting peace, which I think were things that he applied when he was confronting the challenge of Vietnam. Nixon, the peacemaker. I mean, not enough attention has been paid to Nixon as a peacemaker, and there is certainly evidence of it here at the library. But I think I like this quote of Nixon. He was talking to Sapphire, his main speechmaker, and Sapphire had said that that the speech was not that great, that it wasn't going to set the world on fire. Nixon immediately responded to him and said, the whole object of our foreign policy is not to set the world on fire. I mean, because, okay, the atomic bomb was dropped, and yes, it ended the war in World War II, but it also meant that wars from then on you had the possibility of another horror, of another nuclear exchange. And all through the Cold War, every president had to balance their decision-making, their war-making decision, with the danger that something could escalate to a nuclear exchange, which nobody in his right mind wanted. And I think that Nixon was acutely conscious of his responsibility as commander-in-chief when he said that. And then I think one thing is there was an amazing moment during the Nixon presidency in May of 1970. This was after the invasion of Cambodia and actually after the killings at Kent State, when you had young Americans in uniform shooting on young Americans on a college campus, and with the tragedy that happened then, which Nixon took very much to heart at the time. And at one point, he had a sleepless night in May, and he actually, called his car. Everybody know this story where he went out to the Lincoln Memorial. He left the White House, went to the Lincoln Memorial, and he met with these college kid anti-war protesters, and without, his security was terrified, was panicked that they thought he was out of his mind, and but he just wanted to kind of break that barrier, and a barrier now that's today in today's world higher than ever between the president and the people. He wanted to break that barrier and have a direct communication with real citizens who felt strongly and passionately about the war, and one of the things he said about Churchill, he said, I thought Churchill was a madman, at the time during the 1930s, but I was wrong. He was trying to make the argument about Munich, but he related directly to kids, to protesters at that time. He also reduced the size of the U.S. military from, it started at 3.5 million at the beginning of his administration, went down to 2.2. It was enormous reform of our military structure. I think also one of the themes of our book, and we mentioned in the introduction, is that Americans have, at the bottom, have an ambivalent attitude towards the nature of war and invasion through our outer history. We're always hoping for peace, but we're usually preparing for war. And the American eagle is an ambivalent bird having, an arrow in one talon and then the olive branch in the other. We talked about that, and there are a number of different instances. You talk about I go back to, in the 19th century, there was Charles Sumner, he was a Massachusetts politician, and he was very upset about the Mexican-American War, which was initiated by President Polk. And he made a speech denouncing war and saying that war was no more than, was murder, basically. He said, this is in the 1840s. Okay, then he becomes, as a Massachusetts politician, he becomes an abolitionist and very much anti-slavery. He gives, as a senator from Massachusetts, he gives a speech in the Capitol against slavery. And a congressman from South Carolina takes his cane and beats Charles Sumner after having make this speech. Well, as a result of that, essentially what happened is that Charles Sumner, the Senator Sumner, was mugged by history, and he went from being a pacifist, anti-war pacifist, to being one of Lincoln's champions for the Union Army for beating the South and winning the war and preserving the Union. So, it's not always about hawks versus doves of two different factions. What's interesting is the battle in one soul and the way that sometimes we change our minds. Nixon, was the son of his mother was a Quaker. His father converted to the Quaker religion, profoundly anti-war, and yet at the same time he waged war. So I think Nixon, his whole life and his role as commander-in-chief is a perfect example of this kind of ambivalent attitude we have towards the nature of war in our country. Let's see. And then I wanted to just conclude with one, this may seem off topic, but eventually it gets there. 50 years ago, just in this past month, we had the death of Winston Churchill. And when Churchill died, Churchill, when he was planning his funeral, he called it, he had a label for everything, and it was called Operation Hope Not. But eventually he did, 50 years ago, he did pass away. He died. And who was president at the time? It was Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. Churchill in 1945 had not attended FDR's funeral. It's not exactly clear why. It happened quickly. FDR died suddenly, but Churchill did not make it to FDR's funeral. LBJ was an acolyte of FDR. Was a New Deal, was definitely a New Deal kind of guy, and his whole career was started by FDR. And when Churchill died, LBJ said, "I'm not going to go to the funeral," and so he didn't go to the funeral. And neither did his vice president. Humphrey didn't go. None of them went. But there was an American president that did go, and his name was Dwight Eisenhower. And he went on his own power. He went as a private citizen to attend the funeral in St. Paul's, and by the way, there's a chapel in St. Paul's that was dedicated by Richard Nixon to the Americans that fell in the UK, which is another sideline. But Eisenhower went to Churchill's funeral, and then there was Churchill's last. Is anybody familiar with Churchill's last joke? His last joke was that he insisted in his funeral plans that he was going to be taken on his coffin from St. Paul's on the river and taken to Bladden, where he's buried in a churchyard near Oxford, and he insisted that the boat meet them at Waterloo Station, and everybody said, "Well, Paddington is closer. Why don't you do it at Paddington?" He said, "No, this is my last joke." And what is the joke? Okay, the joke is that de Gaulle is still alive, and he's going to have to salute me at Waterloo. And that was Churchill's last joke. What you got? And then you fast forward a couple years later, de Gaulle himself dies, and guess who attends the funeral? Richard Nixon. Okay, he was not about to miss that passing. Anyway.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chris is offered to take any questions if someone would like to ask one. Anybody have a question? Here's one right here. I'm sorry.
I would like to know when the Geneva Conventions started to be written, because one of them had specifically to do with invasions.
Right.
And it was that you didn't invade a country unless there was immediate threat.
Right.
So I'm kind of curious when these rules started to come about.
Well, that's a whole interesting topic the whole legalities of war. And what is the difference between murder and war? Some people say, Sumner at one point said there wasn't a difference. Other people, most military folks would argue that war is different. The war, when you're killing in war, that is very different from murder. But the rules on war have changed and adapted. They changed during. Can you poison a well, for instance? If you're retreating soldiers, can you? That was a topic that was debated. There's a book called Lincoln's Code, which is about the codification of the rules of war during the Civil War. That is very well done. And then there came along other things as standards in terms of the treating of prisoners and the treating, and you're talking about the Geneva Convention was dealing with POWs, and then also things like care for wounded victims of war, which all kind of came along later. But as far as invasion, what we used, invasion is not a legal word. It's more of it's a kind of commonly understood word. We used invasion in the sense of Americans fighting, is that if you're Americans deliberately fighting in a foreign country, for us classified as an invasion. So for instance, When we look at every country in the world, we looked at Switzerland, and we actually accidentally bombed Switzerland during World War II. I mean, at 30,000 feet, if you're bombing Germany, Switzerland's right next door, and mistakes happen, and some people were killed. But we did not classify that as an invasion because it was an accident, and so, but it was a military involvement, if you will. So, I don't know if that answers your question. Please. Yes.
I have a couple questions.
Great.
I'm not looking for argument.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Number one, did Washington know that
George.
The,
George.
the Japanese invasion of Pearl Harbor?
That's
number one question.
Yeah, sure.
Number two, did Stalin, the Soviet,
Yes.
did he have anything to do with a Hiroshima bombing and all that, Nagasaki? What triggered it? You know what I mean?
What triggered?
Aside from the known history.
Right.
I'm digging into the
Stalin?
the background.
Mhm,
Yeah. I have my opinion, but I wanted to get your opinion.
Sure. No, try. I mean, we tried to not be political in our, but we try. I mean, if you do a Google search and you say how many countries have we invaded, you'll find a lot of political rants. And you can pretty much imagine where those are coming from. We tried very hard to not be partisan or to grind an axe. And like everybody has politics, right? I mean, but my co-author and I, we don't have the same politics. And so that kind of forced us to kind of meet in the middle and say, okay, your first question is FDR. Did he know about Pearl Harbor in advance? It's been out there for years, as a conspiracy theory. And yes, they were doing magic decrypts, and yes, they were trying to read the code things, and Bletchley Park was doing the same with the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese too. And so there were attempts to try to find out what the other side, reading the enemy's mail. That was going on, as part of war, and has been for a long time. So now FDR had already met with Churchill on board ship, and he clearly wanted to steer. He would have liked to have steered America towards a course of war because he saw Britain in great distress. He saw Western democracy threatened, and so did he want war? Probably, I would say probably. Did he know that they were going to attack on December 7th, 1941? I think the overwhelming evidence is no. The Japanese achieved strategic surprise at Pearl Harbor, and they pulled off an amazing coup, and they maintained radio silence with the transition over across the Pacific. So the thing is that FDR was very much a guy, and like Nixon, a guy of the Navy. He loved the Navy, and had he known in advance that they're striking on this particular date at this time, he would have warned them to say, "Get ready, guys," or something. And he didn't. I can't imagine everything based on everything I know about FDR not saying. Had they been prepared, if they'd had, say, 24 hours notice warning, it still would have been a war. It wouldn't have meant that there was. You still would have had a war, and so it wouldn't have changed the dynamics of that, except it might have helped a little, maybe saved a few lives, possibly. And then the other question was Stalin had foreknowledge of the bomb. Stalin had the communists had a lot of spies all over the place, and there were lots of sympathizers to communism throughout the West too. You have the spy network in Cambridge, famous Cambridge spies that permeated British intelligence, and so he had foreknowledge of the bomb. And when Truman, after FDR's death, when Truman at Potsdam met with Stalin, and he was trying to disclose that we've got this thing, and this is before Hiroshima, and Stalin knew damn well what he was going to tell him before he told him, and he thought, Truman thought he's actually going to tell him something. Well, no, he already knew, and so I think the thing that's really interesting about Stalin is that this is a hard thing to say, but this is my belief. It's not in the book, but my belief is that had if you had not had the horror of Hiroshima, that at some point in the Cold War, somebody would have tried to use weapons, and most likely those weapons would have been much worse than the ones that were actually used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that in a way that horrible sacrifice that took place there was, may have saved. The sacrifice of thousands may have saved millions and prevented, because it did illustrate to the world the horrors of what atomic war meant. And so.
What I meant was, what I meant was, I think Stalin and Truman were
Yes.
They were
Yeah.
talking.
Yes.
Okay?
What?
I suspect, and I think I've learned that this one too.
Yes.
I think Stalin wanted a piece of Japan, just like a piece of Korea.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
They wanted a
Sakhalin Islands. Sakhalin Islands. Yes.
They will take the north, and the U.S.
Yes.
takes the south, Japan.
But
I think they were talking.
well, I also think that if the bomb hadn't been dropped by the Americans, and the Americans were the only ones that had the bomb at that time for a short window, that Stalin might very well have been on to Paris. I mean, he might have been.
Truman said, "No way, Jose." You know, you
So-
guys come out and say, "We try to save the American soldiers' lives." Yes, it is true.
Yes.
That's a pretty good front.
Yes. Yes.
Truman didn't want that.
And it's true that the Japanese surrender was influenced not just by the bombs, but also by the Soviet invasion too. So yes.
Okay, well, I think we have time for one more question.
Yes. Sure.
I'm just wondering, as far as your opinion of, the CIA running proxy wars, and looking at both the successes and also the failures,
Yes.
if you've seen examples of both.
Yeah, no. Well, when Nixon was vice president in the Eisenhower administration, you had two coups. I mean, those were back, what you might call, if you will, the good old days when a CIA could pull off a successful coup. Then they did in Iran and Guatemala were the two that were done at that time. Now, obviously, those had repercussions, down the road too. But I mean, we weren't directly involved with. I mean, we're not trying to tell all about the CIA in our book. We do talk about, the OSS quite a bit, because, the OSS was, the predecessor to the CIA in World War II, did a lot of interesting things, and were, that you could kind of certainly classify as Americans fighting abroad. One was Norway. Like, did we invade, when we looked at Norway, we looked at every country in the world. Did we invade Norway? Well, no, but the OSS did actually send troops in to Norway in the closing days, and they blew up bridges, did sabotage, did things like that. So